Alrighty. What do we got to talk about today? Hi. So I'm currently reading the rules to another one of these CDGs that, and I'm struggling my way through. It's a fairly large set that I feel is, I don't know, just overburdened, and the rule book is huge, which seems weird, right? You know, the whole point of a CDG is to offload a lot of the game onto cards, but anyway. And it got me to thinking about innovative series or innovative games and how they've kind of changed over time. Used to be, I can think of a few that really kind of struck the world of gaming back in the day as, oh wow, this is weird and interesting and cool and everything. And some of them became great favorites. And as a particular instance, I'm looking at Empires of the Middle Ages as sort of, I would say, sort of the highlight of that. Although I would go to a lot of the stuff companies like Victory Games were putting out. Where there were general concepts like kind of pulsing movement or playing around with that I go, you go structure. But each game had its own sort of design. And the differences that they introduced didn't really generally create a series, right? So, look, Empires of the Middle Ages, they did Sword in the Stars. And much later, Rick Kelly did something kind of in the ancient world. I think he's still working on it. I have one of the games of it, but which I covered, I don't remember. It was set in India. But it covers the ancient empires and how they interact in China, India, and Rome, basically. Another, again, I say the Victory Games games, take a look at something like their Civil War game, which, yeah, you know, the GMT U.S. Civil War, American Civil War, or whatever, has kind of followed up on it in some ways, and then I can't remember what it's called. Is it On to Paris? I think so. On to Paris came out as kind of a follow-up of that system for the Franco-Prussian War. But, you know, in their day, they may have influenced other games, but you didn't see them sort of form a whole series of games. Pax Britannica is another option. Something that, you know, very different style and flavor of game, but you didn't see it sort of spawn its own family. Now, I guess if you look at those Victory games, some of them did lend themselves very well to being put into a series. So like the Fleet series came out, and you had like Gulf Strike, which created Aegean Strike, and was there another one? I don't think so. And stuff and things along that line. And I don't really know where I'm going here, because, you know, in this particular case, I'm looking at Tanto Manta, which to me feels like a Here I Stand not expansion, but something very much based on it. But more weight is being thrown into the series, into the concepts of that original design. So I think Here I Stand was a fucking brilliant game. Okay, I think CDGs in general were really, really interesting. But the more and more of them that I face, the less excited I am about each one. I don't know if that fits with other wargaming type flavors for me. So, for example, until they start, scraping the bottom of the barrel, right? But I'm thinking about things like the Musket and Pike series. But honestly, that also started getting corrupted at some point. Now, that was when they brought new designers in, I think, where they got more and more focused on the difficulties of maneuver, which was not really something I wanted to see too much of, and it ends up making the battles they chose had worse terrain, and they wanted to represent that more reasonably. But they also modified the system in ways that I felt probably were making it more realistic, but also were making it more of a pain in the ass, and just not as much fun as it was. GBOH seems to have stayed pretty true to what it lives with. And again, I'm kind of trying to come to what the answer is in my own head. I don't have a good answer here. This is something that's been playing on my mind for a while. But it's not just the CDGs. It's not just the Here I Stand flavor. So, for example, Sword of Rome will always feel fresh and new to me because there aren't tons of games that followed it. And it's also nice and light, which I find kind of appealing, where it's harder to face something that's being built on the same system. And I know I have my gripe, right? I complain about CDGs because each one has its own little, tricky systems and this, that, and the other. And that's true. And one of the answers to that is come up with series as well. Tanto Monta is not similar enough to Here I Stand that I feel like, I can just say, I'm playing Here I Stand. Virgin Queen was a little closer, but again, it was overburdened in my opinion. It took what was just about in that sweet spot, which is why Here I Stand was so fucking popular, right? It was in a sweet spot, not just for me, but for other people as well. I remember at its time, people were saying, wow, this is one of the heavier CDGs out there. And yeah, I don't really feel that. It's heavier than Sword of Rome, but it feels like it's been eclipsed. Another one that I did more recently was this, what is it? Is it called War of Europe? Or Wars of Religion? Wars of Religion was the French one, which is Time of Wars, the Eastern Europe. Yeah, that was another one very much based on Here I Stand. Unfortunately, that one, the rules were kind of not as good as they could have been. I'm still seeing people regularly asking questions because it's so unclear what the hell, how it's all supposed to interact and everything. But again, it was based on that Here I Stand type framework. But again, it's not just the CDGs in modern time. If you take a look, you have like the Coin series, right? Which initially started out as a certain flavor, the first couple of games in it felt very much like they followed that same flavor. I think what happened was people saw that the mechanisms it was using, kind of like CDGs, could be expanded to just about anything. And you actually have that where, like, now they're creating the Irregular Conflict series. And I think I may be in on another one of them, which the Indian one counted as. To me, it felt like coin. It felt exactly like coin. But, you know, it's a means of delivering a very asymmetrical experience and a certain kind of mechanism where you're flipping over cards and seeing what people can do, and they're based on, you know, this sort of pulsing chart that determines who has first option to grab things and stuff like that, or who has an option to grab things. First option is driven by the cards, just like in the coin series. But again, the coin series sort of got, I think, overburdened. And if you go down to something like Pendragon, which I think is a cool game, to be honest, I had a lot of fun with it, right? Subject matter, the amount of detail it had and everything, I still like it. But it feels like it's taken that sort of core element of a system that was clean and really expressed things nicely, and just thrown so much onto it that it no longer feels that same kind of, I don't know, that same kind of pleasurable experience of something, you know, that just kind of all works together. Seeing it more and more with the Levian campaign games. And some of that is, look, these games when they first come out have unfamiliar concepts behind them, right? So, just like the first war games that came out, the idea of hex grid movement and CRTs and everything like that, it was new stuff. So you didn't want to throw too much at the players. You know, I mean, you don't want to open up a World at War as your first hex encounter, I go, you go war game. I know, there's some people who say, well, I started out with this. Yeah, okay. But did you start out reading the rules for that, right? You know, is that the first war game that you approached without somebody teaching it to you? Because we taught people Empires in Arms, and we taught people who really were not wargamers. What we found was, in both cases, like, those games had this weird sort of panache to them that attracted people, made them willing, maybe the evangelists for them were so strong, made people willing to play those, but didn't really walk away with an interest in, like, playing war games in general, which I found really weird, especially with Whiff. Because that is, like, such a hardcore hex encounter, you know, calculate the odds and all that kind of shit type of game, that it feels like you'd want to expand if you liked it, you know? What is it you liked so much about it? Did you like the production and everything? Look, there are other games that are much lighter that allow you that kind of aspect. I don't know. But, you know, and it wasn't just the subject matter. Because no interest whatsoever in playing, like, at the time I'm talking about, A World at War wasn't out, or at least I didn't have it. But I had my Advanced Third Reich and Empire of the Sun. Or is it Empire of the Rising Sun? I can't remember which one it is. It's Rising Sun. Empire of the Rising Sun. Okay. Which, you know, I thought were better systems in terms of, anyway. I don't, at some point I have to go into this discussion. Maybe I did in the World War II games. I don't understand the grand strategic stuff. I just do not understand the whole how people were so attracted to Whiff. And I mean, we're just talking about like why they were willing to try it and not willing to try other things at all, even though they loved Whiff. Just wow, I have no idea about that. Anyway, as we continue to muddle along in this, again, I don't know exactly where I'm going. But yeah, the Levian campaign games, the ones that I've been looking at, as that series gets older, it starts adding more and more things to handle details that weren't well handled. So, for example, in the War of the Roses one, you have kind of an overarching campaign, which I think is awesome and cool. It's kind of weird the way it works, but it almost feels like sitting down to play, all the Imperium Romanum scenarios and just like keeping score or something at the end of them all. Which, yeah, you could do that. But it doesn't, it doesn't modify things as much as I'd like it to. But it isn't the only game I had at that same time. The Sparta one, the Peloponnesian War one that I did recently, had the same kind of flavor to it, where it's like, yeah, it kind of just, I don't know. Things just don't feel like they're following the history of the scenario before as well as they should, in order to provide you with a more limited and scaled down realm of possibilities, so that each scenario feels kind of balanced or fightable or something. Actually, the Sparta one went in the opposite direction, but in order to allow somebody to build up their power. Something in my mind is just that, like, these things used to kind of be dead ends, more or less. And again, maybe another game picks it up. For example, Empires of the Middle Ages ended up influencing Europa Universalis very heavily. And you had a similar kind of rulers capabilities that showed up in that game. Nothing else really made it over, right? But yeah, the whole kind of very abstracted territories and claims and everything, that didn't make it into much else in the mainstream. Again, I wish I could remember the names of things. This one is unfortunate because it doesn't even have a good box cover that I can identify. Like the way the cover is, I can't read it. I don't know where it is. It's under here somehow. But it's the Rick Kelly game, and it made a real impression on me as the first thing that really was trying to use. Yeah, I'm losing things so much. I lost, oh, maybe it's over here. One of my online buddies noted that I had an extra copy of a map that he wanted, and I can't find it. And I have no idea where it would be. Like, I've checked everywhere where it might have been in my mind, and now I just, found another place where it might have been, and I can't find it. I was trying to get that to him, but yeah, it's just kind of weird. It's one thing when you take like a mechanism like that card flip over to determine who can do what in the coin series, and that's moving on to that system being kind of used in games that are not counterinsurgency and of greater difference from that. and having to build all kind of other mechanisms in play, just like, you could say, well, look, Empires in Arms is an area combat game, right? Yeah, but there were a lot of simple area combat games out there, and then boom, this just leap up. Australia did this. I mean, Whiff sort of was the same kind of thing. It was like, oh, there's Third Reich. Well, let's boost it. Let's level that thing up a little. There was this big jump in terms of throwing a lot more in games, and I just feel like both Whiff and Empires in Arms, Rowland, I don't know, was just this huge leap in complexity and in amounts of things that the game was covering and everything. They were things that were covered before, right? But like the idea of, there were new ideas in there, like the idea of constrained peace. And in a sense, you can take a look at like Europa Universalis and say, well, somebody just took Empires in Arms and expanded it over a much larger era. But there's a big piece there too, which is that huge event-driven system. Anyway, in terms of my personal sort of excitement and whatnot, it feels to me like when I first look at a new series, or at least when I did, maybe less and less recently, but when I first look at one of those new innovative concepts in gaming, I'm really excited by it, right? Coin really excited me when it came out. Labyrinth really excited me. That didn't really go anywhere, right? But Coin really excited me when it came out. CDGs not so much, because the first couple I really disliked. But when I did get caught up on them and kind of found the level of them that I liked, I was really, really excited about them. Levian Campaign, I feel like I struggled with the concepts of that too much. Like, I was intrigued, but not excited in the same way. It didn't just grip me in the same way as Coin and the CDGs did. But then as more and more games come out using that mechanism, it feels less and less exciting. Now, you could kind of say that as a whole with wargaming for me as well, and probably applies to everybody in very much the same sort of way. When, I don't know what you would call my first wargame. The first thing, obviously, look, I had played Risk, but the first thing that I saw that I was like, ooh, this is really kind of covering a specific war and trying to do some sort of simulation value to it. Maybe not using those words because I was pretty young at the time. I would have been, I don't know, 9 or 10, somewhere in there, was Skirmish. That was sort of the first one that really hit me that way. Now, I don't remember if I got Broadsides first, but Broadsides was kind of, a chess-like game and whatever, and nothing else in that series was as much of a simulation, in my opinion, as Skirmish was. Now, you can make arguments Dogfight kind of was, because it's kind of like the Down in Flames series. In terms that, like, you have cards, you maneuver with them and whatnot. It kind of feels sort of like that, so it's like, okay. Except it uses a board for the maneuver. You just play the cards to allow you to move. But yeah, Skirmish was sort of the first thing that I saw that had that kind of, oh look, it's really trying to represent a war, sort of, kinda. It's a pretty simple game. It's not very historical, but it may be more accurate than Washington's war. So at least there's that. And I don't know. I just have run into such a dearth of like, there's no happiness when it comes to revolutionary war games for me. Everything I try that's strategic, I'm not thrilled with what I see. Yeah, from the SPI one American Revolution through 1776, through We the People and everything else, everything feels like it's just, I don't know, it's not catching right, and I'm not sure why. But yeah, and then the next thing was not knowing about war games was Origins of World War II, which, like, for me, I looked at it and that's where I learned, sure, I had seen area combat before at this point with Risk or whatever, but that's where I kind of ran into the CRT, and that gripped me. And what did I immediately think of doing with the CRT? I thought of using it for actual combat games. And then, I find out later, when I start getting into actual war games, that it actually derived from actual combat games. And that, no wonder it's written the way it is. But yeah, I generated, sort of like a combat game on the beach, using stones and sandcastles and stuff like that, and seashells and all kind of stuff. But I don't remember how I randomized, because I didn't have a die. I don't know. I don't know. I don't remember that at all. But I may not have actually played. I think I was just playing around with the idea in my head. But anyway, there was sort of such an excitement about finding something that was trying to model military reality. And for me, it was kind of weird because I got 7 games all at once when it actually swung into the actual combat games. And they were of different types. Some of them were CRT based, some of them were firepower based, and whatever. And so I was being introduced to a lot at once, a lot of different things, a lot of different tastes. But I'm guessing that, for most people, they picked up Stalingrad or whatever. Oh boy. Or Africa Corps or something. And, we're just enthralled by it. But then as they started picking up more and more of the regular war games, well, they're all kind of the same. And that's kind of the worry, right? You don't want to keep playing the same game with slightly different subject matter wrapped around it, although in a lot of ways that's what wargaming is all about, right? So the specifics of situations begin to get more and more detailed and drawn out, and more is being put on to give you a more interesting and differentiated experience. And I'm sure that's what's happening with these series and whatnot. Not all of them. Might be one of the things about the No Peace series is that it all feels, kind of at the same level. Sure, they have their special roles, but it feels like, and I haven't gotten to this No Peace Without Honor yet. I'm actually really intrigued by that one, but I have to. But it feels like they've maintained sort of we just swap out the special rules, and that's enough. That's enough to do it. And, that's kind of the thing. Wargaming as a whole developed very, very slowly, right? Comparatively. If sure, there were speed up times and periods where more came out. Let me swap batteries. But in a lot of ways, what you could, the hobby as a whole kept reproducing things that were little more than a change in the specifics of the situation. Throw on a little chrome to express that particular situation a little bit more differently. But yeah, you had the Avalon Hill Classics and then the SPI, response of, oh, this combat results table is a little bit more accurate and historically believable. And that lasted for years and years. And I don't know how many, I'd say late 60s is when the war games started coming out of Avalon Hill, really. I mean, yes, there were ones earlier, but when they just really started putting out, I don't know, they were putting out a couple a year, but things kind of sped up with SPI coming in to compete with them. And yeah, you had some leaps, but those leaps it didn't feel to me like they required a lot of twisting and let's make this a lot more complicated, etc. But I don't know. Third Reich came out fairly early, like in the early 70s. I don't know when. I want to say like 72, but it may be more like 74, which doesn't feel anywhere near as early to me. But yeah, there was a sort of a jump, these little jumps and fits and starts going forward. And, some of it may be just my perception of time, right? That's all in a period before me, and I can look at it and say, oh, it took place over a long period of time. But then I'm looking and I'm like, yeah, you've been doing these vids for 15 years at least. And, well, maybe not the vids, but, right? Yeah. But you've been back, you got kind of back in the hobby a little bit, maybe close to 15 years ago. And that's all seems like a lot less time somehow than maybe the 5 years between 70 and 75 that I wasn't really involved in, but like it feels like, at least as much time. So I guess, my age and everything is showing there in terms of like what my perception of time was at different periods of time. Because yeah, how long has coin been developing? Well, I don't know when the first one, Andean Abyss, I think that was in the early 2010s. So call it 2012. I don't know. Well, that's more than a decade ago. Let's take a look at a decade of development of those war games overall. Maybe it's because it seems like there's less games now, and each one is sort of more impactful to me. I don't know. Certainly, there aren't as many coin games as there were war games following sort of a standard classic treatment, right? With movement, combat factors, a CRT, odds chart, combat, all that. There's nowhere near what there were in those first, in those first 5 years or whatever, in terms of coin games. But there's a fair amount of them. And I guess one of the things that I got to look at is, hey, and I managed to do this with coin, and it's harder with CDGs because, I can cut off eras of CDGs, but so many of the CDGs and obviously the entirety of Levy and Campaign is going to be periods that kind of interest me, right? But one of the things that I was able to do pretty easily was say, I got a game that covers the Battle of Tannenberg. Do I need another one? You know, I got a game that covers this. Do I need another one? And but these new series are branching out more and more into types of conflicts and periods of conflict that I don't have a good game on. By the way, one of the older, not all that tremendously older, but one of those dead end kind of things that is really exciting and fresh all the time because of that. Oh, another one is Dune, by the way. Not really a war game, but sort of. But boy, does that feel weird and different and stuff like that. But I was going to say Angola. That's a game that nothing took its system up, but it's a really neat system, right? And in some ways, it feels kind of unfair to compare. So, there's a lot of room for a lot of different battles, a lot of different conflict situations to be covered by sort of that classic style war game. But when you start looking at wars at a larger level, and Coin and certainly some most CDGs, are able to cover at a strategic scale. And that's what most interests me in everything. But there's just more room when you're looking at individual battles, right? So something like the area impulse system or something, that corresponds more with the traditional war games. On the other hand, there aren't a whole shitload of those either. It feels like, nobody's decided we're going to do everything using area impulse or whatever, So I don't know, man. I don't know. Again, I'm trying to capture something that deep down I feel is this discouragement and lack of interest in these series as they progress. And certainly a lot less excited than I once was about them. Now, how fair is it? Like, Here I Stand is a peculiar instance because here was a game that I wanted a game on that subject, in particular, a Mighty Fortress, for a long time. I first saw and fiddled around with it, didn't get to ever play it, but a friend of mine had a copy of it, and I really, really wanted to get a game of it going. I first saw that, I don't know, say in the mid-'80s. And since then, I had wanted it, right? So we're talking over 20 years when we go, to 2000, whatever, maybe 25 years. It's a better call. And then Here I Stand, and I'm like, oh, okay, well, maybe I'll like this as much. I liked it a lot better, it turned out. A Mighty Fortress. I ended up picking up the reprint of it. It's kind of a dud when it comes down to it. It's nowhere near as cool a game. It looks a lot like Armada, which might be part of the issue. Here I Stand's a really, really good game. And so I was particularly excited about the subject matter, and it was a different kind of game. The only thing that was kind of like it in the CDG realm was Napoleonic Wars, I guess, which also, that one kind of charmed me at first, but then I saw it played by a shark. Now, I've seen Here I Stand played by shark-type players. I've played with them and not been bothered by it. I was exceedingly bothered by what Napoleonic Wars, when played optimally, turns out to be. It's not the Napoleonic Wars, so it's like, great. Um, yeah, I'm trying to capture sort of that feeling of why the hell, am I not that interested, not that excited? Well, you know, I would buy. I can remember back in the days when I was buying a Victory Games game, every couple of months or whatever. My poker winnings would get me, or my work, depending, would get me enough money that I felt like, yeah, I can splurge and buy myself a brand new game. And I would, I'd pick up something like Central America or whatever, and I'd be really, really interested and excited by how, how the air and naval system worked and everything. Kind of like the fleet game, kind of same kind of thing. Kind of like the strike games. They all used something that was very similar in terms of system, which is kind of weird. They were like, I want to call them operational. Because of the scale. But the time span was much, much shorter. Like I think there were like 2 turns a day instead of more traditional operational is probably like a turn every few days. But to me, they feel operational because they play much the same way. At least the ground games do. And then the air and naval systems are worked into this with interceptions and all that. And a lot of it felt very similar. Even though each one was a completely different game, a lot of it felt very similar in flavor. Flashpoint Golan was a little different, but trying to accomplish the same kind of stuff. But they kind of failed to keep grabbing me. Like, I would buy one and fiddle around with it and be excited for a little while, but then I'd lose interest pretty quickly in them. Not sure why. Feels like it's a different kind of rationale behind them. I'm less interested in the subject matter. The stuff that's coming out. So much stuff now is coming out in subject matters that I'm interested in, which is one beautiful thing about this era and why I keep buying games. If everything was fucking, World War II, modern, whatever, like it was, like the vast majority of everything was when I first was getting into gaming. Yeah, I probably would not be buying games, but there's plenty of stuff coming out covering situations that have just not been covered well. And that not covered well is an important part because I don't really consider, like, if I look back at when the games of the late 70s, early 80s, all the innovation seemed to be happening on the most popular subject matter. When you got into stuff that was kind of off that World War II, American Civil War, maybe Napoleonic's sort of main line, you were kind of looking at, okay, well, let's just put out, like a simple area combat game. And I'm trying to think here. you know, like, say, take Empires and Arms, take out the combat system, go with like either buckets of dice or a CRT or something like that. Take out the diplomacy, just make it that everybody's free to do whatever the hell they want and cut deals and break them however they want. That's the kind of game you were seeing in a lot of cases. You know, they just throw it in. So like, yeah, you saw a lot of that shit with like 30 Years of War stuff and everything. It was like, oh, come on. Can't you guys do something interesting? And now the hobby's really actually finally catching up, where I feel like there are interesting mechanisms that are being used that aren't just, you know, let's do a simple area combat game and like theme it, essentially. But yeah, it is getting harder. Like, I mean, I should be so into these games that I'm buying, but maybe the hurdle of learning them and everything, I just feel like I've ossified too much. I don't know. Oh well. All right. Anyway, this has been a ramble of little value, I'm sure, but again, it's been on my mind, and I don't know what the hell to do, so I wanted to chat about it.